Do you ever wonder why some ads stick in your mind for years while others disappear instantly? There's a psychological principle behind the world's most memorable marketing campaigns that few marketers ever know. It's called Ostranenie, and it's why Apple's AirPods ads stop you mid-scroll, why Nike commercials give you goosebumps, and why Ugly Vegetables drove 51% brand awareness in the UK almost overnight. I'm Nate Desmond, and today I'll show you how top CMOs are using this literary principle from 1920s Russia to create marketing that captivates attention today. I first learned about this concept from Gaston Torin, Chief Growth Officer at Oddbox and former Google marketer. Here's what he told me.
So talking about actually one concept that when I learned it, I never thought it was going to be useful, but then it has been incredibly useful. I learned about Ostranenie, which is a concept from a literary school in my undergrad. And in that annual workshop, we were basically learning different literary theories and then applying them to our writing. And one concept that really stuck with me is a concept from a literary school that is called the Russian Formalists. So it's a literary school from like the early 20th century. They are from Russia, and they coined this term that is basically called Ostranenie.
The Russian formalists were trying to understand what makes literature truly engaging, what separates ordinary writing from something that captivates us. Their answer wasn't what you might expect.
What they said, at that point, they were trying to understand what is literature? Like, how can we define scientifically what is literature? Like, why certain pieces of writing are called fiction? Like, is it because they're not true? Is it because fiction is the opposite of truth? And their answer was no, it's not about that. What literature does, it kind of makes familiar things strange, and it makes strange things familiar. And that's what Ostranenie means. It basically means something like estrangement. Like it makes something strange, but also opposite, it makes really strange things familiar.
Think about that for a moment. Great writing doesn't just tell us what we already know. It shows us familiar things in unfamiliar ways, and it makes unfamiliar concepts feel accessible. This creates a powerful cognitive effect that makes content more memorable and engaging. To help us understand this concept better, Gaston shared an example from literature, specifically from the Netflix adaptation of Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude.
And you can probably realize that in most stories, for example, quite recently I was watching the latest Netflix series, 100 Years of Solitude. 100 Years of Solitude is an amazing novel from Garcia Marquez. Netflix now did it as a series, which is incredible. I highly recommend watching it. And that series, for example, at a certain point, it starts raining flowers. So out of nowhere, it starts raining flowers. And it's really strange, but at the same time, the book makes it look like something that is completely normal. And nobody really almost sees that, something out of the ordinary. And I feel like that's what Ostranenie means.
This is a perfect example of the principle in action. Raining flowers is clearly strange and unexpected. It defies our normal experience. But the way it's presented makes it feel natural within the story's world. This creates a memorable moment that sticks with us precisely because it breaks our expectations in a way that still feels coherent. Here's where this gets really interesting for us as marketers. Gaston believes that this same principle explains why certain marketing campaigns capture our attention while others fade into the background.
It kind of makes the unfamiliar familiar, and then vice versa. Like it looks at familiar things in an unfamiliar way. And great advertising does exactly the same.
To illustrate this, Gaston shared a brilliant example from Apple's AirPods campaign that perfectly demonstrates this principle in action.
I share, for example, one example from Apple, which I love. It's for like the latest AirPods that they were launching at that time. And what they did, it was basically showing a really busy city that was like incredibly chaotic and noisy. And then when someone basically pressed the AirPods, and they were trying to show noise cancellation as a feature, but when someone basically just pressed the button of noise cancellation, suddenly all the noise, all the people in the city started flying and going up to the sky, and the city became really peaceful. And that's exactly Ostranenie in action.
Let's break down what makes this example so powerful. The busy, noisy city is familiar to all of us. It's an everyday experience for millions of people. But by showing the noise physically flying away into the sky when the noise cancellation is activated, Apple makes this familiar experience strange. They're visualizing something invisible, noise cancellation, in a fantastical way that immediately communicates the benefit. It's memorable precisely because it transforms something ordinary into something extraordinary. And Gaston didn't just admire this principle from afar. He applied it directly to his work at Oddbox, a company that rescues, quote, imperfect fruits and vegetables that would otherwise go to waste.
But in order to drive people's attention, our current campaign, and a lot of people in the UK already know the brand. So we have 51% brand awareness in the UK. So a lot of people already know about Oddbox, they hear about Oddbox. But we wanted to flip that expectation. So the whole campaign is around, who are you calling for? Are we actually the odd ones, or are supermarket the odd ones? Or basically throwing away fruit and veg that is perfectly edible just because of the look of it.
This is a brilliant application of Ostranenie. Oddbox takes something familiar, ugly or imperfect produce that's being rejected, and it makes it strange by questioning who's really being odd in this situation. They flip the script, suggesting that perhaps the established norm, perfect-looking produce wrapped in plastic, is actually the odd practice. Let's hear more about how they executed this campaign.
So the whole campaign is based on that concept. And for example, we have an amazing ad that is a beautiful potato that looks really odd. And the tagline is not as odd as potatoes in plastic. Because, for example, we don't use any plastic in our boxes. For supermarkets, yes, they have perfectly looking potatoes. Isn't it weird that we wrap them in plastic? Why do we do that?
Again, we see Ostranenie in action. The campaign takes something strange, oddly shaped vegetables, and makes it familiar by presenting it as normal and natural. Simultaneously, it takes something familiar, plastic-wrapped produce, and makes it strange by questioning why we accept this practice. To understand how Ostranenie works so effectively in marketing, we need to look at Gaston's insights about how humans create meaning.
I think meaning is probably one of the things that I have always obsessed about. Since actually university, I have obsessed about meaning. I'm not sure if you know that there is a discipline called Semiotics. And Semiotics, what it does, it studies how human beings build meaning. Through language, we build a lot of meaning, but also through other things, like, for example, even our non-verbal communication. I am building meaning with facial expressions. And meaning is such an interesting thing because in the end, I think it's what distinguishes probably us from other species. We give meaning to stuff.
According to Gaston, this human tendency to create meaning is central to how we process the world, and it's directly related to why Ostranenie works so effectively. The key insight is that meaning is created through contrast, not balance.
And what is interesting is that usually the things that we remember the most, so the meanings that made most difference in our lives, have a lot to do with contrast. So that's why I think balance is not necessarily the way to build meaning. If I ask you what happened last week, you're not going to tell me the routine. You're not going to tell me those balance moments. You're going to tell me moments that were really, really kind of out of balance. For example, today I asked you, how's everything going before we started the podcast? How's everything going in Singapore and with the office? And you told me about flooding in the office, right? Which is something out of the ordinary, out of the balance.
This psychological insight explains why Ostranenie is so powerful for marketers. We remember things that break patterns and create contrast. When marketing makes the strange familiar, or the familiar strange, it creates that necessary contrast that makes messages stick in our minds.
That's why I think it's so important, especially as marketeers, to think how we can attract attention. And attention always needs to break the balance in order to build meaning.
Now that we understand the principle, how can you apply it to your own market? Based on Gaston's examples, I've identified 3 key approaches. First, take something familiar to your audience and present it in an unexpected way, like Apple did with the noisy city that flies away. Second, normalize something unusual by presenting it as perfectly natural, like Oddbox does with imperfect produce. And third, question established norms by making them appear strange, like Oddbox questioning, why do we wrap vegetables in plastic? The key is to create that contrast that Gaston emphasized. As he put it,
what it shows you is something that is very familiar, like a busy city, how the product is completely making that space unfamiliar. And that's why it draws your attention.
To implement this principle effectively, start by identifying the familiar elements in your product, category, or customer experience. And then ask yourself, how could I present this familiar element in an unexpected or surprising way? Or, if your product introduces something new or unusual, you can ask, how can I make this strange element feel familiar and natural to my audience? Remember, the goal is to create that contrast, which makes your marketing memorable. I'm Nate Desmond, and you've been listening to an excerpt from Horizons Pod, where I convince marketing leaders from around the world to spill their secrets for the rest of us. If you've enjoyed, make sure to subscribe here on YouTube or wherever you enjoy listening to podcasts.